Hi, you're watching Investor Insights. I'm Vic, and to those who still function on the lunar calendar, Happy New Year. For the Chinese out there, 新年快樂，恭喜發財. Now, what better topic to talk about today than the Chinese? And essentially, I've had several comments and emails asking me how America exports inflation, and since the biggest victim of it is China, or is going to be China in the very near future, why not discuss it? So, just to make things easier, for the sake of shortening the length of this video, we're going to talk about inflation as being rise in prices rather than the expansion of the money supply. And when I refer to banks, it doesn't matter if I'm talking about a bank, a community bank, a big bank, or a central bank. It's essentially all the same when it comes to money, because when the Federal Reserve, the central bank, prints money and lends it out for nothing, then it's the same thing as a bank producing these notes out of nowhere, because they can just go to the Fed and get all these new $100 bills that was created out of thin air. So banks, it doesn't matter what bank I'm talking about, it's the same thing. So to illustrate in a very, very simplistic way, and I must stress that it is very simplistic. Those who want to find flaws in it, please feel free. I'm going to get into the much more complicated discussion straight afterwards, so just bear with me. Imagine you had a whole bunch of American consumers out there, and they want to live beyond their means, so they buy a whole bunch of Chinese goods. Now, because these guys can't afford it, that's why it's called living beyond your means, they have to do it on a credit card. Now, the bank prints money just out of thin air and gives the debt to the American, which as a result of having that credit card, but all that new money goes to some Chinese company that manufactures these goods. Now, the debt stays in America, but all those new banknotes that were created out of thin air goes over to China. Now, those banknotes out of thin air is actually the QE. Alright, so let's get that one straight. Now, that Chinese company then takes all these new notes and takes it to its central bank, or any bank, doesn't matter, and exchanges it for some yuan, the local currency. Now, that bank doesn't have that much currency to change for all these new circulated American notes. So therefore it goes ahead and prints a whole bunch of yuan notes and exchanges it to this Chinese company. Now, it then takes all those crisp new American notes and puts them away in storage in this vault, and it's locked up, and that's the end of them. That's what's called foreign reserves. Now, the Chinese company then puts that money into circulation. So what you essentially have, or what essentially has happened, is the new American dollars, which went from the American central bank into the Chinese system, have been taken out by the central banks, or the central bank, and has been replaced with local currency, but an absolute crapload of it. Now, if you go back to some of my first videos and I discussed the whole concept of money, when you inject a large amount of new paper currency, or fiat currency, because it's not backed by anything, into a financial system, an economy, then you've got a finite amount of goods and services within that system that are being chased by a hell of a lot more pieces of paper. So therefore, the price rises. So therefore, that's how America exports inflation over to China. Now, there is no real inflation when it comes to the US dollar, because essentially that money's been taken out of circulation by the Chinese central bank. So America, or I should say the almost former Fed chairman, Ben Bernanke, always lays claim to not having any inflation over in the States. Well, that may be true, but that's mainly because it's being exported to everywhere around the globe. That's why you saw such crises over in the emerging markets last October and last November, because you had a spike in inflation. Now, that spike in inflation is more evident in poorer countries, in countries where the per capita GDP is tiny compared to, say, America or Australia or the European nations. Because essentially, that's why they're called emerging markets, because most people there are either peasants or heavily involved in manufacturing. They're still developing. And the problem with inflation in those countries, like take China for example, I still call it emerging, because the per capita GDP in US dollar terms, you're looking at sub $5,000. So you only make $400 US a month. You're not going to be out there buying Audis or BMWs or houses or anything of that nature. All you're doing is buying food, clothing, and paying for shelter. That's essentially it. And the most important one being food, because without food you're going to die, obviously. So another point to keep in mind is when inflation runs, it's because food prices or commodity prices worldwide is in US dollars. And it doesn't matter if it's locked up within the central banks or in free circulation. When you've got food prices everywhere priced, or commodity prices as well, in US dollars, then by definition, when the Fed prints that much money, or that many much more US dollars within that whole global system, then therefore food prices must rise. And the issue with those emerging markets, which as I said includes China, when you're earning about $100 a week in US dollar terms and food prices are in US dollars, what happens with QE is that food prices will just skyrocket. And when you're poor, you've got basically no margin for error. If you wake up one morning and food has gone up 25% for that week or whatever, well, that 25% will mean the difference between you eating or starving and dying. So that's why you saw all those protests over in the emerging markets, and that's why you're going to see a whole lot more of that happening in the possible near future as a consequence of all these US dollars being circulated. Now that example I gave was a very, very simplistic one involving the consumer and a Chinese company. In general, it doesn't matter how you look at it. To export inflation, all you have to do is export the one thing which is causing inflation, and that is the currency. So when America prints all this currency, and as I've stated in many previous videos, America produces nothing. And so it must import everything. Now to import whatever it is, they send all these dollars overseas and incur all this debt. So it's basically an economy of debt finance consumption, whether it be government or the consumer. But all these poor sucker countries which are dumb enough to supply their hard manufactures and valuable goods or commodities in exchange for this fiat currency or toilet paper, find themselves inundated with just this. And as prices rise, the pieces of paper become less and less valuable as the volume of them starts to increase at a geometric rate. Don't forget, QE is only going to increase because the debt burden gets larger and larger. So as America exports more and more money overseas, inflation is going to run higher and higher and higher in all those countries that essentially are propping up the American financial system by sending over their hard assets, whether it be manufactured goods or commodities. So what's the likely outcome of something like this? Well, if you look at the countries which were heavily indebted, such as for argument's sake for Greece, there's every probability, there's every chance that America will end up just like Greece in the very near future. Because through QE and the Federal Reserve holding rates down, the Americans can enjoy a standard of living which has been artificially promoted by its central bank, but it clearly cannot afford it. So what essentially happens is if interest rates are supposed to be 10%, but they're being held down to 5%, it means that you can take twice the amount of debt and still have the same ability to service it when the interest rate was 10%. So in the instance like the US finds itself in right now, you're looking at a situation where the debt mounts and mounts and mounts and mounts. And there will be a tipping point when those countries that are propping up the states through giving them all these goods essentially for free will say no more. We're inundated with all your toilet paper, which is worthless because we can't even buy food with it. Our citizens are revolting because they've got no money to buy food because, as I said before, food has just gone through the roof in terms of price. And they will just stop shipping things over to the States. And when that happens, well, it means that there will be a lower demand for US dollars, which means that that currency is going to spiral into oblivion. Now, when you have a run on your currency, the central banks, or the central bank I should say in this instance, has to find a way to promote its own currency so that people will then either invest in it or hold it. And the only way it can do that is by raising rates, so that the currency actually looks attractive to people now. And when the currency spirals further and further into oblivion, rates have to go higher and higher and higher so as to further entice people to, as I said, buy US dollars again. Now, these are very, very simple examples. But as I said, when you look at Greece, the Greeks were already heavily indebted years and years ago before they even joined the euro. But by joining the eurozone and adopting its currency and thus the common interest rate, the Greeks got themselves further and further into debt. Because it's human nature. If someone gives you cheap debt, you just borrow and you spend until such times as the debt just becomes too much for you to service. And that's where Greece found itself after several years of being in the eurozone, that the country became so indebted and the creditor nations became so wary and thought, man, these guys aren't going to be good for it, that they stopped lending to Greece altogether. And thus you began to have this eurozone debt crisis, which essentially was going to happen anyway, but it spawned basically in Greece in the most explosive manner. Now, America is going to be exactly the same thing. People will realize that these Americans aren't good for it. The debt that they have, they can hardly service if interest rates were to go up even just a smidgen. So they're going to stop lending to them through either giving them goods in exchange for nothing. So exporting inflation is not a very difficult concept. It basically comes from sending all these printed currency overseas and let those guys handle the inflation problem.